This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on highlights of BRICS Summit 2023 and its expansion. The participants are Professor Swaran Singh, Strategic Analyst, and Vinay Kumar, Journalist.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Johannesburg to participate in the 15th BRICS Summit, which is being held under South Africa's chairmanship. The highlight of this BRICS Summit is call for expansion. There is a consensus on expanding this 5-nation grouping and to include 6 more nations. It's a major step ever since BRICS was formed. Professor Singh, first of all, your immediate reaction to this decision to expand this grouping of BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, to include 6 more countries to become members from January 1st, 2024. And the new members will include Argentina, Iran, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia and Egypt. How do you see this?
Let me first of all congratulate and wish well all my listeners, especially in the backdrop of Chandrayaan-3 having landed on Moon. And that has come very timely as Prime Minister is in middle of the BRICS summit meeting in Johannesburg. We saw that the host president immediately congratulated Indian Prime Minister. And even before Chandrayaan-3 had landed on Moon, Indian Prime Minister had already extended that we should have BRICS Space Cooperation Consortium. And in that sense, that sentiment was reciprocated by Cyril Ramaphosa, the host president of South Africa, saying that this is an achievement for the BRICS family. I think that has set a very different tone to how BRICS national leaders are going to interact and how Indian Prime Minister's voice is even more stronger in the BRICS nations, as India has proposed several things, of course, other than the issue of expansion, which has been lying dormant for quite long time, other than de-dollarization, which is again ongoing debate. This whole issue of reformation of international institutions, not just United Nations, but particularly the financial institutions, because BRICS is primarily an economic grouping, has brought India a certain advantage because of this gush of very good news. And in that sense, I think expansion, on which we understand that all national leaders in principle have already a consensus that BRICS perhaps needs to expand. And that partly comes from the fact that we have now known that about 43 countries have shown interest in finding some kind of engagement with BRICS nations, and 23 of them have already applied to get membership of the BRICS nations. To me, that is an enormous endorsement of the credibility of BRICS nations and the potential that these nations see for themselves and for BRICS. And therefore, they want to engage themselves and even become members of BRICS nations as soon as possible. Now, that, of course, is not an easy exercise. The Sherpas have been discussing this issue for almost 3 years now, thinking how to build consensus on procedures, on standards, on protocols, as to what should be the criterion to bring in new members. We also know that the original jargon of BRIC that was given by Jim O'Neill way back in year 2000-2001 was based on his premise that these were emerging economies and G7 nations should invest in these countries for per dollar returns becoming better. But of course, as BRICS nations have evolved over years, and of course they immediately in 2010 added South Africa, the second qualification came to be that they were also not just emerging economies, but also influential nodal points or hubs in their own region in leading the developmental narratives of their region in that sense. And now, of course, we hear when there are so many countries willing to come together, they will have to also further refine their criterion of how they can bring in new members. My feeling would be that there is a discussion for 3 to 6 new countries joining as members, but maybe like becoming more innovative, they could think of bringing in other nations, reciprocating to their enthusiasm in terms of making them dialogue partners, observers, special invitees, and so on. I think there is a great anticipation of grouping showing agility, flexibility to reciprocate to this enormous enthusiasm that we see several nations showing towards the BRICS nations. But of course, we have to be cautious because BRICS works on consensus, and it is sometimes not very easy to bring everybody on board on every issue. So hopefully they will have a set of achievements, and of course on some other issues they will also build a broader understanding to move forward and take a little more time in resolving some of those sort of disjunctions that may appear on some of the issues between the five BRICS nations at this stage. But the mood, it seems, is very positive, and intention is very, very positive as well from all five countries.
Yeah, Professor Singh, if we just look at what has been India's stand earlier, also India was opposed to any efforts to broaden the BRICS membership earlier, and India's concern was that such an expansion could potentially dilute the BRICS fundamental objectives and weaken the established consensus among the current members. And on the other hand, China was pushing for this initiative, believing that the BRICS alliance should embrace an expanded membership and it should accommodate more developing nations, probably indicating towards Pakistan, in its earlier stance, which had stirred a diplomatic kind of conundrum, in BRICS. So this has come about with consensus, and we have reasons to believe that China has fallen in line. And as Prime Minister Modi said at the BRICS summit, India was keen on accepting new member states as partners in the grouping. He said that the expansion of the grouping was indicative of changing times and world order. So you think India also became flexible, as you said, over the past 3 years, there have been efforts, to expand BRICS, and all the BRICS foreign ministers were also engaged in this exercise, as you pointed out. And Prime Minister Modi also pointed out that expansion and modernization of BRICS is an indication that institutions of the world must get accustomed to changing times. So this is, I think, indication enough that India had also adopted flexibility in its approach, and the Prime Minister had said, he will welcome any consensus on this issue, and everybody should go by consensus, all the five BRICS nations.
Exactly. I think that is what is interesting here, that the reality, as you are saying, is much more complex. In fact, if you see, much of the Western media is caricaturing it. In fact, they are saying that the expansion of BRICS could be counterproductive in that sense. And, they would like to build that rhetoric for themselves. And India wouldn't like to do that in any case. Yes, these countries have their own disjunctions as well. They are different sizes. They are different political systems. When China became the chair for the first time, they added South Africa. And then, of course, in 2017, again, when China was chair, they launched something called BRICS Plus. Sometimes they used to call it Friends of BRICS nations also. So China has been seen as a country most enthusiastic in expanding the BRICS membership. And over the years, one explanation that has come about is that because China's economy today is, $19 trillion. It's about 3 to 4 times compared to the rest of the BRICS nations put together. And it wants to use BRICS as a platform for its Belt and Road Initiative, trade and investments around the world. And that obviously makes other nations much more careful as to whether new members are going to be all just friends of China in the name of friends of BRICS. More interesting it is that now during the Ukraine crisis, even Russia, which is under enormous sanctions and of course almost censor and boycott from much of the West, has seen that BRICS has become one of the very important platforms for Russia to find that kind of international support and platform to speak. So that sense of Russia also towing the Chinese line simply because it wants to also use BRICS platform. You look at President Lula da Silva speaking that, they can't think of including any members who wants to come, and it has to work on consensus and on criterion. And I agree with you, at some stage India was relatively reluctant, but if you notice lately the visibility of India, the kind of increasing credibility of India, and the economy, we are 5th largest economy going to become 3rd largest economy. So we are a very strong economy, potentially strongest and fastest growing economy among major economies around the world. So India's on confidence, India's on partnership. And what we are saying today is that India has become increasingly agreeable to add nations which might appear as strategic partners of India already. For example, India supporting Saudi Arabia or Iran or Indonesia. India today shares very different relation with these nations. So even if they are having partnerships with China, they are also strong partners of India. So in that sense, India's confidence in allowing expansion of BRICS is very different today. But at the base of it, and that's my quick last point on this, India has always been country that has propagated focusing on principles, on norms, on legalities, on making sure the criterions are built such that later you do not get into a situation when it looks like that, some country was favored by one of the countries who were members at that time. I think it is perfectly fine for BRICS to make sure that they move very, very carefully and do not get into a situation where they regret any of their decisions.
And among suggestions which India made at the summit was also a suggestion which included call for cooperation in space exploration. And incidentally, very happily, this call came, hours after India became only the fourth nation after the US,
Yes.
China and Russia to successfully soft land on the lunar surface. So
And-
that was
and
also,
first country to land the southern pole of,
Southern Pole. And,
which is,
rightly,
which is complex.
Prime Minister Modi was very happy. Congratulatory messages and laudatory notes from all the BRICS leaders at Johannesburg and around the world also. But Professor Singh, if we look at the takeaways and the highlights of this 15th BRICS summit, the leaders held discussions which included global economic recovery, partnership with Africa and the global south, and they also reviewed the progress made on the BRICS agenda so far. And Prime Minister Modi also called for a strengthened BRICS. That will be, acronym was B for breaking barriers, R for revitalizing economies, I for inspiring innovation, C for creating opportunities, and S for shaping the future. And he made several interventions, which included, joint efforts of BRICS countries for protection of wildlife and establishing a repository of traditional medicine among BRICS countries, in which India has a very strong footprint. And also he called upon BRICS partners to support AU's permanent membership of the G20 and, reform of WTO, multilateral financial institutions, and defined timelines for United Nations Security Council reforms. So all these points were raised by Prime Minister Modi in his interventions. But overall, if we see the highlights or the takeaways of this BRICS summit, how would you try to put them in a nutshell?
I think Indian Prime Minister is known to be a very impactful speaker and also increasingly using these acronyms, which make it more memorable and interesting. And BRICS nations, remember, will be in Delhi as part of G20. G20 always has a mini BRICS summit as well. So all of them will soon, within 3 weeks, again meet in New Delhi. So in that sense, it's a continuum of India's engagement, which is reinforcing how India is, really becoming very, very powerful, impactful. And reflection of that is the vision that we have. For example, Indian Prime Ministers pushing for making African Union as 21st member of G20 is a reflection of India's vision. India's hosting of the Voice of Global South Summit, attended by 128 countries in January this year, is a reflection of that vision. World knows, and those who know the future know very well that Africa is the future, both in terms of demographics and development. In second half of this century, the whole entire global focus is going to be on Africa. So engaging Africa is very clearly understood by Indian Prime Minister and Indian leadership. So using this opportunity of summit meeting being in Johannesburg and building that strong connect, and you will see that about 67 national leaders, I suppose, are going to be attending and meeting these 4 national leaders now. President Putin is not physically there. As part of BRICS Plus dialogue, the BRICS Africa outreach. And that is a great opportunity for India to build that strong connections with African leaders and global South leaders, because that is going to be the USP of India. India is increasingly becoming seen as voice of the global South, voice of emerging economies. And to close my comment very quickly, India today believes in multi-alignment, working together, building partnerships in as many sectors, in as many countries as possible. And here is an opportunity of India emerging as a country that not only has a very powerful partnership with countries like Russia and United States, but also is seen as an integral part of emerging economies, voice of the global South, very respected country among small island states, for example. So this whole spectrum of engagements is what makes India's presence at all these forums, including BRICS summit meeting and other meetings of the BRICS, visible, but I suppose also very credible and influential. And this is a work in progress. And BRICS would immediately also show that imprint of India, just as it engages with other 4 leaders there. And hopefully they will be able to come about with some decisions. There's great hope that they're going to invoke and increase use of local currencies increasingly, which is part of their first step towards de-dollarization, and potentially perhaps in some future also launching a BRICS currency. That's going to be a very important groundbreaking initiative of BRICS, and of course expansion as well is another issue which might see some results.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Singh, for this elaborate discussion and focusing on the highlights and expansion aspects of the BRICS. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
You were listening to a discussion on highlights of BRICS Summit 2023 and its expansion. The participants were Professor Swaran Singh, Strategic Analyst, and Vinay Kumar, Journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on a mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on a YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.